Welcome to the Psychology of Black Womanhood podcast, where research meets the real world. I'm your host, Dr. Dion Stevens, professor of psychology and co-author of the Psychology of Black Womanhood book. Today, we're talking about something that's been long overdue, the intersections of Blackness, queerness, fatness, and femme identity. For too long, society has been trying to tell Black fat femmes who they are and what they deserve. The ongoing discussions around music superstar Lizzo's body and identities is an example of this. Some suggest that she's become a beacon of representation and empowerment for Black fat femmes everywhere, while others have argued Lizzo's just recreating alternative versions of stereotypic cultural norms. In today's episode, we'll unpack the complex layers of being Black, fat, and femme in a world that often only makes room for certain kinds of bodies and identities. We're talking with Dr. Mary Sanyonga. Dr. Sanyonga is an assistant professor of Black feminisms in women and gender studies at Sacramento State University. Her research investigates the Black fat figure in society. Let's get into it.
I want you to give us an understanding what is meant by Black, fat, and femme research, and particularly its relevance to discussions of body positivity and body politics specific to Black women historically.
I think what really comes to mind for me when I think about Black, fat, and when it comes to gender and naming different genders, sometimes I've had trouble in some ways of naming genders in ways that aren't exclusionary, nor relegating certain genders to certain presentations. So I use femme for myself, for sure. But for other genders, I really want to be aware of how I don't create this monolith of us, right? Making sure that's not everyone who presents as femme is one gender, nor does femme belong to just folks who appear to be cis women. So when it comes to Blackness and gender, I really think first about Starkey Bartman or Sarah Bartman as that person that allows us to find those forces coming together in the ways that Black fat bodies are spectacles, or the embodiment of all that is essentially hated by the West. So I think through the ways that our bodies have been seen as essentially that embodiment of what is not a Western body, to be overabundant, to be a body that is not controlled by certain quote unquote social mores, bodies that are seen as really the physical manifestation of here is why these populations fall outside the realms of what it means to be quote unquote human. So I think for me, Black fatness is not just something that's to be investigated through fat studies, but really as a genesis of anti-Blackness, and something that Deshaun Harrison helps us understand as anti-fatness, as anti-Blackness, of really understanding how the Black fat figure demonstratively set up the way that the world understands utility, the way that the world understands bodies as repugnant, understanding bodies as these objects. So that's how I come to that area of study and how I think through it. And with gender, just really understanding the ways that white supremacy, colonization has made it so that Black folks in general, especially knowing from Hortense Spieler's, like being ungendered as Black people and Black flesh being relegated towards being punished, relegated towards being just ungendered. So trying to connect all those different areas, I think with anti-fatness and anti-Blackness, it really has to come through that lens of Black studies. I think that's where it gets me to understand it's not just this individual manifestation of marginalization, but how does it structure a way of thinking of the world and thinking of one another and what bodies are violated, what bodies aren't being violated.
I appreciate you bringing up Sarah Bartman, because I think that's an important figure, figuratively, when we're talking about Black women and Black bodies. So even the word fat, it's interesting. Can you sort of break down, because some people are like, well, that's an offensive term, but it means a very different thing for Black women. And when we're thinking about our bodies, and like you said, in terms of Sarah Bartman, what does that mean in terms of Black womanhood?
There's so much to go with here, right? Because originally when I came to it, I thought this is just another way to describe my own body. That as opposed to just naming my body in the ways that are medicalized and pathologized of obesity, that being this scary big O word that is very much showing bodies that are not within the model of what is healthy, that is very constructed, not within that model. There's so much in that model of what it means to be healthy that again, it's forced upon us, right? So when I think of fatness, I think of it as a way to describe my body. And previously have been taught within, at least I guess, of fat studies, not even fat studies, I guess more body positivity lens, was like fat is neutral, it is not neither good nor bad. And I think talking with other Black fat folks, just thinking through like, yeah, I don't know if I could see anything as just neutral. Because in the same way that I can't just see, oh, for my embodiment as a Black person, Black is just neutral. It's like, no, I think it's always inherently politicized still. So I don't see fatness just as neutral, but as a way to describe a body, as a way to name that as a fat person at the individual level, as well as navigating systemic, that people will experience due to fatness that others won't, whether it is the consistent ways that fat people are told that we are always close in proximity to death, the ways that our bodies are seen as representation of our own ability to control ourselves, whether through appetite or having disciplined work ethic. So all these ways that I think it could help us to understand what is our positionality in the society is where I see fat as a useful deployment to help us there, as opposed to thinking that, oh, it's a word I should shy away from and use euphemisms that feel less charged. Like, not that I ever have used it for myself, but I know folks saying curvy, bigger. And it's just these words that I think sound palatable in a way that for some folks can feel nice. I understand when they go there if it's harder to come towards fatness. But for me, naming fatness and claiming myself as a Black fat femme is really important to show that these are the identities that I see being influential in my own life and how I interacted with in the classroom, as a professor, out and just in the world in general. This is what is really important to me and how it shapes my view of myself and the view of the world that I have.
I appreciate you sharing that personal perspective because I think it sort of grounds and helps us understand how this idea of fatness is part of identity. It's not just, like you said, an objectified view of someone. It's really shaping how you're valued and how other people give value and how you have to negotiate. And it's politicized. I think, though, for a lot of people, the most vivid example of the intersection of Black womanhood, fat embodiment is Lizzo. And of course, you wrote a great article titled, "If I'm Shining, Everybody Gonna Shine," centering Black fat women and femmes within body and fat positivity. And what I wanted to think about is, what is it about Lizzo that made her an emblem of body positivity for so many?
I think there are a number of things that with Lizzo and the time that she came into greater popularity, as well as the subject matter of some of her songs and the imagery, how she became that symbol. In some ways, I don't know she could have been in this space without talking about her body. There's certain ways that with Black fat women and just looking at media portrayals, at least I'll say in my own work, looking at it since the 90s and just seeing the ways that either it's said for you or you say something yourself about your body, that there's no way that she could negate her body. First and foremost, she had to address her body in some way. Black thin women do that as well, navigating the ways that their bodies are either objectified or judged alongside really limited standards of being. So with Lizzo, I think what's interesting is just that there was space that she engaged in. I'm not saying she did it in perfect ways either. I think there are ways that, especially as folks enter spaces of popularity where the parameters of being are limited, and it's no surprise then that some of the values that they may hold will not always match with what folks may hold as fat liberationist values. So I think it's with her songs, where even if it wasn't explicitly saying, I'm a Black fat woman and this is who I am, this is great, just even her claiming I'm that bitch. That was something that I think people could take as, wow, how amazing this is to see a Black fat woman doing that. And to see it in some ways being celebrated, some ways being something that I think for some audiences, almost taking her as like an avatar, I guess, in some ways, of like taking on what she's saying and take it for themselves, feeling valuable with themselves. So there are a number of ways that I think her embodiment as a pop star is really interesting as well. Like, I do appreciate some of the work that she's done, but I also think there's a lot of tensions there that I see too. That at the same time that she has said and center Black fat women, there have been times where there have been certain missteps and certainly revelatory in how she may consider body still in a limited way herself, given the industry that she's in.
Could you give us some examples of what you would say were missteps or different ways that she might have presented herself that doesn't necessarily be representative of how you or others might see this?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think some of the things she's done that feels contrary to either holding a fat liberation politic or even saying bodies are okay as they are would be ventures towards having music in weight loss commercials, ventures towards having a clothing brand that is shapewear that's repackaged, especially as body positivity became more of a common conversation in the past few years. I know that the sales rates for most shapewear companies not plummeted dramatically, but it was a noticeable dip for them. And so brands like Spanx were less in favor, not as prominently advertised, but her brand Yitty being one that is saying shapewear, even though it says refashioned shapewear, still is shapewear. So what does that mean then for the values of saying your body is good, however, use these type of items to make it seem more palatable in a certain way, to make it seem more polished in a certain way. Those tensions that I see, those are, I think, the spaces that we can challenge her as well as someone who holds a public space the way that she does.
One thing I find interesting is that right now in the popular culture, we're celebrating that Lizzo lost all this weight. It's posted all over the magazines. I get People, and it was one of the big articles about her fantastic weight loss. And then we also know there's a big push for Ozempic and all these other products. How do you think this comes together at this moment of time, and specifically how it's affecting Black women?
Mm-hmm. There are just so many things that come to mind with this. It feels almost like this web of trying to connect all the pieces here. So I think the rise of Ozempic, I'm also thinking about this context of it coming up following the period of shelter in place, at least when it came to COVID-19. Because I think that's a very important socio-political context for us as well, or socio-cultural context of navigating through a pandemic, the loss of life, and the further reiteration and rise of ableism as well. So folks like Amari Barberin, who is a Black fat disability content creator and just wonderful analysis, telling us the ways that Black disabled bodies are seen as a burden is inherently tied to the ways that people are taking a very individualistic take on health. That for themselves, this is what health means, not something that is informed by community health or informed by actual well-being, mental, emotional, spiritual well-being, but health that is seen as just simply what does your body look like and how tied to people wanting that agency. So I think seeing that as well as the rise of all these GLPs being these different medication I use in scare quotes, they are intended to treat diabetes, but the rise of Ozempic came as a weight loss medication. My own introduction of knowing about Ozempic is as a weight loss medication, and I heard about it being a diabetes medication second to that. These medications are seen as these antidotes to fatness, these antidotes to fat embodiment in ways that I think is just so indicative of how, as a culture, wanting to have agency over our bodies and seeing the pandemic as something that thieves them of having that agency, that individualistic will, I think they all coalesce together. That diabetes is seen as something that fat folks get. And despite that medication being for diabetes, it's not being promoted as like, wow, how great this medication can help folks. But no, this is something that folks can lose weight with. I think with that, with still moving through folks wanting agency following shelter in place of COVID, that as well as the ableism and the anti-Blackness of it, I just think all together so that if Lizzo's now seen falling into lines of being closer to the standard of beauty, it's celebrated. And I guess it's not shocking to me, given her industry and how prevalent weight cycling is and prevalent dieting is, that she'd be part of that as well.
So would this align with what you call the neoliberal model of body positivity? Do you see that there's a tension then between individual self-love and the larger systemic forces at play with fat phobia and anti-Blackness?
Thank you for that question. I think it's definitely emblematic of that, right? Because I think there's this way that when fat liberation gets distilled down to just body positivity, it comes in at the individual level. Whereas, do you feel good about your body? Do you like who you are? As opposed to, what are the structures we need to dismantle for society? What are the things that systemically target fat people. And those are things that get so divorced to me when body positivity is at the forefront, because it is about individual self-love, individual self-confidence. It's not necessarily about the forces that be being disrupted, especially when we see how deadly anti-fatness and anti-Blackness is when it comes to the medical industrial complex, when it comes to those who are seen as a threat and are harmed by the extra legal systems at hand. There are just these ways that it gets siloed to just the self. That's not liberation, just for the self to feel good. What does it mean for a community to work towards liberation? What does it mean for a community to disrupt these systems and instill avenues towards either mutual aid or community care that try to ameliorate these different conditions?
Do you think that there's a different impact on Black audiences or Black women versus non-Black audiences when it comes to this impact of Lizzo's presentation?
Yeah, I really appreciate this question because I think a lot about how differently audiences take up Lizzo. That what it means for Black fat women could be, I'm seeing myself. And I think what was powerful when I first saw Lizzo and her talk about especially Missy Elliott and naming those ways that we could see different either generations or iterations of Black fat women in media and feel greater possibilities. So I think that's powerful. And even with Missy Elliott, knowing that throughout her career, certain imagery that she's used has not always been positive about or featuring Black fat women. Certainly music videos showing them as voracious in a way that was almost violent. There's different ways that knowing the cultural context they navigate is not going to be liberation, but it's going, in some ways, can be representation that's helpful. So I see that for Black fat women and other Black fat folks. However, for non-Black audiences, I do recognize the magnification of Lizzo. That for them, it reminds me of how often thin folks will tell fat folks as a compliment, a seeming compliment, you're so confident. It's so amazing to see how confident you are, with the underlying message being that, wow, to be your size, to be of your embodiment, how could you ever be confident? And I see that for the way that they take up Lizzo is that, wow, if someone who looks like her can be confident, I can be confident then because I'm not a Black fat woman, but I could still feel good as someone who is that distant from the social standard of beauty. So that's how I see in different ways they take her up as this object to make themselves feel good. And that is not something that is unique to her. I know for many Black women in media, non-Black audiences, and particularly white women, will take them up as a space to be different type of themselves, like either feeling more aggressive or feeling more what they seem to think as a bad bitch, when it's like, that's not you. And there's something about the Blackness of it all that feels really tied to how they try and use Black women to be that talisman of confidence for them.
I'm glad you brought up this framework of confidence and beauty. You brought up Missy Elliott, and it clicked to me that historically, Black women, especially in music videos, were hidden. I'm thinking about Kelly Price. For a long time, she said she wasn't allowed to be in music videos, and her career was stalled because she was a larger woman, even though she has this fantastic voice. And then CNC Music Factory, the real singer of that song was a larger Black woman, a fat Black woman, and they put a thin model to mouth it in the video. And so I think what's interesting about Lizzo is that she's the first example in mainstream that's framed as sexy and beautiful and appreciated. Do you think that she has any impact in the Black community in terms of how people are seeing beauty and empowerment?
I think it's fraught. I think it's still very fraught because at the same time, I've seen some Black audiences say, well, she is pandering to white people. That is a space that I've seen a lot of that critique of her. My response to it is that I don't see her as pandering to white people, but I think there is a good name of why do they clamor, though, to her in this way? And to me, again, it goes back to the idea of them seeing, here's this avatar of confidence that I could take for myself and not necessarily engage her as a person, but as an object that makes me feel good. So I think, yeah, with Black audiences, the critique has been that of seeing her as someone that white folks really love. I do want to push back against this narrative that still haunts, I think, Black people. Like, oh, Black people don't deal with fat phobia, or there's no fat phobia within Black communities. And that's not the case, especially if the critiques of Lizzo are like either she panders to white people or that she's doing so much, like why is she constantly putting it in our face? Why is she trying to make us like her? Is what I've also seen as critiques of her when it comes to primarily Black audiences, that the particular ways that fat phobia, I think, comes up within community is highlighted here. That her just existing and her existing in the ways that other, I think, Black women artists exist as well by wearing outfits that are revealing. The ire that she gets versus other Black women artists is so indicative of how, for Black fat women and femmes, we're seen as not supposed to be doing too much. So I think she hits at that button for some folks of being like, why are you pushing it in my face? As opposed to she's existing in this realm as well.
So I like this idea that you talked about not giving space to her. And I know we're putting a lot on her because she is a celebrity and the artist. What would an intersectional fat activism then look like? And one that includes the experiences of Black fat femmes and also disrupts these systems of oppression rather than just simply focusing on promoting self-love.
I think with that, I return to Deshaun Harrison and thinking about what is the residue of anti-Blackness, or what is the tendrils it flows through. And I think with anti-Blackness, like that's where we start then. We have to start with the anti-Blackness of it, that to truly address the ways that Black fat women navigate marginalization is to not just see anti-fatness as something that's, again, at the individual level. When folks try to make sense of, okay, if people do experience oppression because of fat phobia, the intervention that sometimes gets proposed is not seeing, again, fatness as a social identity or social location, but seeing it as something that is controllable. And so as opposed to addressing the system, trying to change the person. It clearly is not going to work, right? It's just not going to address the actual, it's not going to change anything. It's still falling into the fat phobic, the anti-fat logic that the body itself is a problem and not the system itself. So I think for Black fat women, we need to address that anti-fatness is part of anti-Blackness. And that's something that is, I feel like people just try and do an additive analysis of like just fatness, then Blackness, and then you get Black fat women's experiences, as opposed to like, these are inseparable conditions. Because as Black fat women, and for myself as a Black fat femme, I can't think of the ways I've navigated anti-Blackness that have not been as instrumentally informed by anti-fatness. The ways that Black fat children are not seen as vulnerable because of their race and their size. The ways that Black fat women are seen as caretakers in the workspace, at home, any space they enter. I can't get to those type of marginalizations if I see them only as an additive analysis. Like they have to be at the same time. And so I think for Black folks, we have to see anti-fatness as part of our understanding of a foundational way that the world is structured. That it's not just simply added onto it, or for some Black folks, like, no, what does it mean that for Black bodies, no matter the size, fatness will be a way that you'll be seen as a violent threat? And how that can be instrumental in how we see them victims of state violence as well. Thinking about Eric Garner at his size, how his fear was not legitimated because of his size, because of his Blackness, because of his skin tone. How for so many Black fat victims, that is so tied together. We can't separate them out. And I really want to emphasize that.
So your own work is actually challenging and bringing awareness about these structural issues, which I think a lot of people have not thought about. I think you're exactly right. We frame them as two separate identities and we don't see how they're linked. So what is the next step in terms of research that you're doing around this type of work?
Absolutely. So I have a manuscript in development that's looking at the rise of GLPs, or different medications like Ozempic, and connecting that to the ways that religiosity had promoted thinness, and thinking through what does that mean for this current moment of this resurgence of thin as the embodiment that is aspirational. Because I see a really clear parallel between our current time and the early 2000s of just how much thinness was promoted essentially at a very early age, and really want to investigate that through the religious lens that I think is very interesting from the 1950s as well, is how much that promoted the types of foods that we eat and the healthism that is currently on rise right now with what is seen as natural foods that people try and eat, and how that's moralistic as well. So that's one of my projects. My larger project is investigating Black women who attended universities within the University of California system. So UC, such as UC Berkeley, UCLA. During the 1960s and 1970s, I did previous work on UCLA and found a number of Black women who were activists during the 1960s and 70s, and especially around the time of Angela Davis being dismissed from campus. So it's an archival project where I'm interviewing as well these women from this time frame to illustrate this through line of Black women's activism as well as work towards community care. So that's my larger project, as well as I currently serve on the editorial board for the Fat Studies Journal. So always looking for intentional, great articles that are investigating anti-fatness through a critical lens.
So moving forward, what do you think is going to be happening next for you? And you think other women coming forward, what would you want to say to them?
There's so much there. Wow. I mean, I think there's possibilities, I think, especially in this current moment of the terrors are all around us. And I understand that there's a lot to feel scared about. I also see a lot of possibilities of the way that solidarity work has saved us and continues to save us. So for myself, I'm from the Los Angeles area. And although I'm currently based in Sacramento, my family's still out in LA. And the fires that happened this January in the Los Angeles area were devastating to witness. Terrifying. And what was restoring or filled my heart or really made me feel like, okay, there's still a possibility, is seeing the mutual aid work that happens. So I think beyond these systems, the progressive model is not something that I believe in, that things will always get better each year and each year. It's like, that's not the case. It's the communities that make it happen. And so seeing folks that came together to provide food for one another, who provided shelter in different ways, information across communities, that's something I look forward towards in a number of arenas. Like, how do folks at the ground, how do we care for one another and ourselves? So that's what I'm keeping my eyes on. How do we care for each other through many apocalypses that visit upon us, that we get through this with each other?
You were just listening to Dr. Mary Sanyonga share insights from her research examining the lived realities of being Black, fat, and femme. To explore more of Dr. Sanyonga's work, including her research, community initiatives, and social media connections, just visit this episode page on the Psychology of Black Womanhood website. Thanks for joining us on today's episode of the Psychology of Black Womanhood podcast, where research meets the real world. We're really enjoying these discussions that mix knowledge with personal stories. And with guests like Dr. Sanyonga, we hope you're walking away with something valuable to reflect on. We'd love to hear from you. Share your thoughts or tell us what you'd like us to explore next by leaving a comment on the platform where you're listening. Until next time, keep showing up, speaking out, and making space for the real stories of Black women and the research that centers their experiences.